when you take the fat out of something, it tastes like garbage. And so what a lot of the food companies were forced to do when they had to go fat-free due to public demand was to go and add sugar to make it taste good. So all those products that said fat-free, what they didn't tell you was that they were high in sugar. And so we ended up basically, I think at that point, developing an addiction to sugar as a society because we were basically inundated with all these products with added sugar and sold the promise that it would protect our health and our heart if we ate them. And now, we know that it's actually the sugar that can cause heart disease too. It's not just saturated fat, but actually sugar's linked to cardiovascular disease just as much as fat is. So we really, I think, need to understand that and know that it's important to consider these things and also to know that these are long-term implications. I think that's one of the problems that we have a hard time with wrapping our minds around. It's kind of like smoking, like when people think about smoking tobacco or smoking cigarettes, teenagers, if you say to them, oh, don't smoke, you're going to get lung cancer, 30 years from now, they don't care, right? Because they don't worry about 30 years from now. They're worrying about what's happening tomorrow.
Now we can tell them you may have significant problems within the next 5-10 years, not just 30.
Exactly. So that's the thing with sugar. Again, when we talk about this and think about like, okay, you're not going to drop dead today from having an Oreo cookie, but guess what? You're going to get health complications probably pretty soon down the road if you don't make some changes in the way that you eat. So I really think that messaging needs to get out there and hopefully, it can help people and inspire them to maybe make some changes.
So what is your role in all this? What, from a neuroscience perspective, what are you trying to figure out? What is it that makes, what triggers the addiction response or, what are you trying to figure out again?
Yeah. So we've been focused on initially really what triggers that addiction response. And so the thing that we've been able to really pin down is that sugar can affect the brain in the ways like drugs and alcohol can, because sugar can release dopamine, which is a neurochemical that typically is released as the rewarding component of, having a glass of wine or smoking a cigarette or doing cocaine or whatever your, vice might be. Dopamine release is the hallmark of drug use. And so that's the high that people get, and that's what people are always chasing. And, food doesn't do that. Normally, when you eat something, it doesn't release dopamine in your brain, but sugar does. And so sugar can act like a drug. And I think that makes it very unique because it's a food, right? It has calories and, it's included as an ingredient in many, many of the foods that we consume. But in my opinion, it's also a drug because if you look at the criteria for addiction that are laid out in the medical community in terms of, what you need to do to be considered, an addictive substance, sugar does all of them by far.
Well, yeah, it felt radically different before and after eating. So the act of eating definitely seems to have a big psychological effect too, with it.
Yeah, the whole idea is, when you eat something, it isn't just the calorie content and the nutritional value. I think that's one of the issues that we're facing these days with a lot of the highly processed foods is that they can affect us emotionally. People eat to manage their emotions. People eat to make themselves feel better. People eat when they're stressed. People eat when they're bored. And so there is a big emotional component to eating. And that's why a lot of times, people feel differently after they have a certain type of meal. They might temporarily feel calmer. They might feel, happier. And again, it's because depending on what you're eating, if it's got a lot of sugar in it, it's probably releasing that dopamine and it's affecting the brain in a way that is going to make you happy temporarily. But the problem is that is a very short-lived experience. And, very quickly after, you start to see that people then feel guilty and they feel down and they get those the highs and the lows of addiction, and the lows get lower and the highs don't really get any higher. And that's really that cycle that people find themselves in that leads people to, end up overeating, end up, eating in excess of, what they intend to. And that's where we see a lot of times people developing many of the health problems that can arise.
Yeah, I'm sure you've had this conversation with your partner. What do you want to eat? I don't know. What do you want to eat? I chose last time. Well, I don't want to eat there. You get into this fight, over nothing. And then when you go eat, you feel better. And, everyone kind of stops grumbling at each other and, it's more pleasant.
Yeah.
What would drive such significant behavioral change like that? what's going on?